1707, having forced Augustus II to abandon the alliance with the Tsardom of Russia and recognize Stanislav Leszczynski as the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Charles XII, along with his army, was stationed in Saxony. While his army was being restored, the Swedish king was planning a new military campaign, hoping that, having deprived the Tsardom of Russia of allies, he would easily defeat it. Having recovered and replenished its supplies, the Swedish army of about 35,000 soldiers began a military campaign against the Tsardom of Russia on September 1, 1707. Rapidly advancing, the Swedish army crossed the Vistula, but the Russian troops located in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did not plan to give a general battle, but instead they began to retreat to the north and east, using scorched earth tactics so that the Swedish army could not replenish supplies along the way. At the same time, detachments of Russian cavalry harassed the Swedish army, avoiding major battles. Thus, Peter I planned to slow down the movement of the Swedes and weaken their army. Despite the growing problems with provisions, the Swedish army continued its march and at the end of June 1708 crossed the Berezina River south of the city of Borisov. At the same time, Lewenhaupt set out from Riga with a huge convoy, planning to unite with the army of Charles XII for a joint attack on Moscow. By implementing this plan, the Swedes would have received a sufficient amount of provisions for an attack on the capital of the Tsardom of Russia. On June 17, the Swedish army occupied the city of Mogilev and began moving towards Roslav, planning to go to the rear of the main Russian army, which was located in the vicinity of Smolensk. Having learned about the enemy's maneuvers, Peter I withdrew his army to Mstislavl. The Swedes tried to force a general battle on the Russians, but the Russians avoided it. Only the Russian cavalry constantly attacked the advancing Swedish army. On September 9, during one of these attacks, Charles XII only miraculously escaped capture or death. Realizing that they would not be able to impose a general battle on the Russians, the Swedes began moving towards Smolensk. To continue the movement to Moscow, Charles XII urgently needed food supplies, but he did not know where exactly Lewenhaupt and the convoy were located. Meanwhile, Charles XII ordered an army of 14,000 under the command of George Libaker to attack Petersburg and capture nearby ports. The defense of Petersburg at this time was ensured by the 8,000th Russian army under the command of Apraxin. The battle near the Neva took place on September 9, 1708. During the battle, the Swedish army suffered a crushing defeat and was forced to retreat. On September 13, without waiting for the convoy, Charles XII held a military council. The Swedes had two options: continue moving to Moscow through Smolensk in the hope of replenishing supplies along the way, or turn south to the territory of the Hetmanate. The fact is that Hetman Mazepa promised Charles XII food, as well as the support of a 50,000-strong Cossack army. It should be mentioned that before the events described, Mazepa enjoyed the favor of Peter I, so many historians are still arguing about the reasons for his betrayal. Most likely, the reason for Mazepa's transfer to the banner of Charles XII is quite obvious. The fact is that the position of hetman was elective, and having come under the authority of the Swedish crown, Mazepa expected to be able to transfer power over the hetman by inheritance. In addition, after a series of victories for the Swedish army, few believed that the Russian army would be able to effectively resist the Swedes, and Mazepa simply wanted to be on the winning side. Not risking starting a siege of Smolensk without sufficient supplies and food, the Swedish army turned south, planning to capture Starodub and its environs to replenish food supplies. However, the plans of the Swedish king turned out to be obvious to the command of the Russian army. Therefore, when the Swedish army crossed the Ipet River, Charles XII learned that the Starodub garrison had been significantly strengthened, and the peasants were ordered to take refuge along with food supplies in the forests and swamps. Meanwhile, Lewenhaupt's corps was moving towards the Swedish army, but on October 9, in the vicinity of the village of Lesnaya, it was attacked by the Russian army. As a result of the battle, the Swedes were defeated and lost their entire convoy, which passed into the hands of the Russians. Only a small part of the Swedish corps managed to leave the battlefield and join the army of Charles XII. On October 10, having received news that the convoy had fallen into the hands of the Russians, Charles XII ordered his army to begin moving towards the Desna River. Soon Mazepa arrived to Charles XII, but since the Cossacks refused to support him, instead of the promised 50,000 soldiers, he brought only 5,000. Nevertheless, the Swedes were in no hurry to abandon their plans, planning to replenish supplies in Baturin and begin an attack on Moscow, but luck was clearly not on the side of Charles XII. Having reached the outskirts of Baturin, the Swedes found only ashes on the site of the city. The Russian army continued to avoid a general battle, while the Russian cavalry continuously carried out harassing attacks on the Swedish army, and also destroyed the Swedish garrisons left in the Hetmanate. In constant skirmishes with the enemy, the Swedish army slowly melted away, but Charles XII did not give up the idea of imposing a general battle on the Russians. In the spring of 1709, Mazepa told Charles XII that a large amount of military supplies and food had been collected in Poltava in case of war with the Ottoman Empire, realizing that this was his last chance to continue the campaign against Moscow. Charles XII ordered his army to begin moving towards Poltava. On April 13, the Swedish army reached the outskirts of Poltava and immediately began siege operations. The siege of the city proceeded very slowly, and despite the fact that the Swedes made more than 20 attempts to storm it, they did not bring any results. On June 15, Peter I arrived near Poltava, where the Russian army had gathered, but nevertheless he was in no hurry to take active action, while the Russian command was choosing a suitable place for the crossing. Charles XII went out on June 27 to reconnoiter the area, during which he encountered a detachment of Russian Cossacks. As a result of the shootout, Charles XII was wounded in the leg. An amusing fact is that on this day it was the birthday of Charles XII, and the Cossacks, without knowing it, congratulated him. On June 31, the Russian army crossed the river near the village of Cherniakovka and began building a military camp. Having set up a camp 5 kilometers from Poltava, Peter I ordered the construction of 6 redoubts, placing them in the shape of the letter T between the Yakovets and Malobudishinsky forests. In an effort to gain maximum numerical superiority over the enemy, Peter I ordered Hetman Skoropadsky and the Kalmyks of Ayuk Khan to join the Russian army near Poltava. Skoropadsky's Cossacks arrived at the Russian army camp on July 5, but the Kalmyks were delayed. Having received news that the Russian army was soon to receive reinforcements in the form of Kalmyk cavalry, Charles XII decided to act immediately. On July 3, he ordered a new assault on Poltava, which again turned out to be unsuccessful, after which he decided to give the Russian army a general battle. By this time, Charles XII had about 37,000 soldiers at his disposal, but since he did not plan to lift the siege of Poltava, he decided to use 8,000 infantry and 8,800 horsemen in the upcoming attack. Since the number of the Russian army was more than 50,000 soldiers, Charles XII decided to use the effect of surprise, planning to put the Russian soldiers defending the redoubts to flight and thereby cause panic in the Russian camp, after which the Swedish cavalry was supposed to cut off the enemy's path to retreat. In simple terms, Charles XII hoped to repeat his success in the Battle of Narva, not realizing that he was facing a completely different Russian army. On July 7 at 23:00 the Swedish army formed battle formations. The infantry formed in 4 columns, under the command of Generals Sperre, Stackelberg, Roos and Lagerkrona. The Swedish cavalry, under the command of Kreutz and Hamilton, positioned themselves behind the ranks of infantry on the left and right flanks. At dawn on July 8, the Swedish army attacked the Russian redoubts, which were defended by about 4,000 soldiers. The effect of surprise that the Swedes were counting on gave results, thanks to which they managed to immediately capture 2 unfinished redoubts, destroying the Russian garrisons, after which the Swedish army began to have difficulties. The garrisons of the remaining Russian redoubts did not falter under the onslaught of a numerically superior enemy, but began to fiercely defend themselves. The Swedes sent cavalry to help their infantry, but at this time the Russian dragoons under the command of Menshikov, having formed battle formations, advanced to meet the enemy. The Russian horsemen managed to repel several enemy cavalry attacks, after which they received an order from Peter I to return to the vicinity of the camp. Menshikov refused to carry out the order, which is why he was removed from command and the Russian cavalry began to retreat. After the retreat of the Russian cavalry, Charles XII ordered his infantry to stop storming the redoubts and, bypassing them, begin to move towards the Russian camp. Not all Swedish infantry were able to carry out the order. Rus's column, which stormed the third Russian redoubt, was badly battered and lagged behind the rest of the Swedish infantry, so Rus ordered his men to retreat to the Yakovets forest to restore battle formations. Peter I, noticing that Rus's column lagged behind the main forces, sent 5 dragoon regiments and 5 infantry battalions against it. Having suffered losses as a result of the short-lived battle, Rus tried to retreat to the Swedish fortifications in the vicinity of Poltava, but was soon blocked by Russian regiments, after which he had to capitulate. Soon after this, there was a pause in the battle, which both sides used to restore battle formations. Peter I decided not to defend in the camp, but to give the enemy battle in the field. He withdrew 42 infantry battalions from the camp, which he built in 2 lines, and 17 cavalry regiments, which were located on the flanks of the infantry. The Swedes formed 12 infantry battalions in 1 line, with 52 cavalry squadrons located behind the bark. The easy victory at Narva played a cruel joke on Charles XII, who, despite the numerical advantage of the Russians, believed that his more experienced infantry would be able to overturn and put to flight the enemy. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Swedish infantry attacked the Russian regiments. After a short exchange of fire between the Russian and Swedish infantry, a bloody hand-to-hand fight began. At this time, the Swedish cavalry launched an attack on the left flank of the Russian infantry, which was forced to quickly form a square, but the Swedish horsemen never managed to reach their goal, as they were attacked by Menshikoff's cavalry, and were forced to retreat. The appearance of Charles XII inspired the right wing of the Swedish infantry, which intensified its onslaught and began to press the Russian left flank. The Russian battalions, not expecting such enemy pressure, began to retreat back, which threatened to create a gap in the ranks of the Russian infantry. The situation was saved by Peter I, who led a counterattack at the head of the 2nd Battalion of the Novgorod Regiment. The appearance of Peter I inspired the Russian infantry, which not only stopped retreating, but began to push back the enemy. At this time, the right flank of the Russian infantry began an attack and was able to put to flight several battalions of the left wing of the Swedish army. The Swedish cavalry tried to save the situation, but was also put to flight by a blow from the Russian cavalry, and General Hamilton was captured. The Swedes were defeated. Gaps began to form in the ranks of the Swedish infantry, which the Russian infantry used to encircle the enemy. Charles XII realized that the battle was lost and left the battlefield along with his personal guard. Having reached the siege camp, he ordered the entire remaining army to hastily leave the outskirts of Poltava. Having been defeated near Poltava, Charles XII and Mazepa managed to escape from the battlefield and take refuge in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The Swedish king planned to persuade the Ottoman Sultan to start a war against the Tsardom of Russia. The fact is that as a result of the Battle of Poltava, as well as the subsequent flight from the Russian army, almost the entire battle-hardened Swedish army died and was captured, so Charles XII understood perfectly well that without the help of the Ottomans he could not defeat the Tsardom of Russia. Meanwhile, Peter I restored the Northern Alliance, under the terms of which Denmark and Saxony declared war on Sweden, and the Tsardom of Russia pledged to conduct military operations against the Swedes in Finland and the Baltic region. In 1710, the Saxon army besieged Danzig, which was defended by a Swedish garrison, and the Danish army advanced towards Helsingborg. However, the allies of the Tsardom of Russia were plagued by failures. The Danish army was defeated and was forced to retreat to its territory, and the siege of Danzig also did not bring any results. The Russian army, on the contrary, was successful. In 1710, the Russians managed to occupy Riga, Revel and other Baltic fortresses, establishing control over Estland and Livonia. In addition, Apraksin's corps also carried out a successful offensive, establishing control over the cities of Viborg and Kexholm. Towards the end of 1710, Peter I received news that the Ottoman Empire was preparing to enter the war on the side of the Swedish kingdom. Having decided to act proactively, Peter I declared war on the Ottoman Empire and hastily organized the Prut campaign, which turned out to be unsuccessful for the Russian army. As a result of the failed Prut campaign, Peter I had to make peace, returning Azov captured in the last war to the Ottomans, but at the same time the Ottoman Empire pledged not to support the Swedish king. The war continued and, as a result of the joint actions of the Saxon, Danish and Russian armies, Sweden lost control of Pomerania and Bremen-Verden. In 1713, the Russian army began active operations in the territory controlled by Sweden, Finland. Already on May 10, after prolonged shelling from the sea, Helsingfors capitulated. The Russian army continued to build on its success, as a result of which on August 28 it managed to establish control over the capital of Finland. The Russian fleet was also successful. On August 6, in the Battle of Gongut, the Russians managed to win a major victory over the Swedish fleet, which ultimately allowed Russian troops to establish control over almost the entire southern coast of Finland by 1714. Realizing that Sweden was not able to fight with the entire Northern Alliance at the same time, Charles XII decided to concentrate his efforts on the Danish-Norwegian Union, planning to force it to capitulate. In 1716, Swedish troops invaded Norway and took control of Christiania on March 25. However, this was where the Swedes' successes ended. The Swedish army, battered as a result of the long war, could not quickly defeat the Danes. In December 1718, during the siege of the Fredriksten fortress, Charles XII was killed by a stray bullet and the Swedish army was forced to retreat to its territory. The Swedish throne was taken by Charles XII's sister Ulrika Eleonora, which led to the strengthening of England's position at the Swedish court. With the support of England, the Swedes managed to make peace with Saxony, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Prussia and Denmark, but this did not improve their situation. Sweden simply did not have the strength to fight against the Tsardom of Russia, so the Russian fleet began to carry out raids on the Swedish coast. Only on September 10, 1721, a peace treaty was concluded between Sweden and Russia, under the terms of which Livonia, Estland and Ingria, as well as the Viborg and part of the Kexholm district of Finland, came under the rule of the Tsardom of Russia. For these territories, the Russian Tsar undertook to pay compensation in the amount of 2 million riksdaler, as well as to return the occupied territories of Finland, except for the specified counties. Having gained access to the Baltic Sea and, as a result of the war, becoming one of the great powers, the Tsardom of Russia was renamed the Russian Empire on November 2, 1721, and Peter I took the title of All-Russian Emperor. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.